بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. أما بعد، أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. We concluded last week's lesson by looking at the section regarding the prostration of error. And I mentioned the various principles and usuls and rules with regards to when exactly would a person make a prostration of error and when a person would not be required to make a prostration of error. And this brings me on to a question which I forgot to mention in last week's lesson. And that is that sometimes what happens is that a person, he makes a sajda sahwa. He makes a prostration of error in salah, but in reality, he wasn't supposed to have made the prostration of error. But what happened was, without knowing the masla, without knowing the exact ruling, he made the prostration of error. Now the question is that by making the extra prostration of error without the need for it, without the reason, without the actual reason of doing it, does that affect his salah? Would his salah and prayer would now become invalid or not? So the answer is that if a person, and let's say for example, if a person didn't recite the tasbih in ruku, Subhan Rabbiyal Azim, he did not recite the tasbih in prostration, in sajda, Subhan Rabbiyal Ala, and now he thought to himself that I missed out the tasbih, I need to do a sajda sahwa, I need to make a prostration of error. Now if that person, and as I explained in last week's lesson, you don't have to, because if you miss out something which is sunnah, you don't have to make a prostration of error. Prostration of error is only made if you miss out something wajib, if you miss out something obligatory. So what did this person do? He made a prostration of error. Now the question is that would that person's salah break or be invalid? So the answer is no, because the person making extra sajdas or making a prostration of error, that does not break the salah. And I did touch on this particular issue before as well, that increasing something in the salah, not necessarily your salah will break. Not necessarily your salah will be invalid. It's only when you did something less than what you have supposed to have done, only that will make your salah invalid. It's similar to the janazah prayer, where there are 4 takbis, which is obligatory, which is farz. Now if somebody performed 5 takbis, his janazah salah would still be accepted, would still be valid. However, if he did 3, then the janazah salah would not be done. Why? Because 4 is farz. So exactly as well, that if somebody did do an extra sajda sahwa, extra prostration of error, his salah would still be considered valid and would still be considered okay, and there's no need for him to repeat the salah. Now in this week's lesson, the aim is to conclude this section regarding the prostration of error, and also thereafter look at another ruling, another section, and this section is with regards to the sajda tilawa, i.e. the prostration of recitation, i.e. when there are certain verses in the Holy Quran where if somebody was to recite it, it then becomes obligatory for that person to prostrate, and that prostration will be looked at under the next section and the next topic of Imam Quduuri rahmatullah alayhi's Mukhtasar. Now, the first topic which we are going to look at is with regards to if a person was to have a doubt in Salah, whether he prayed 3 rakats or whether he prayed 4 rakats. What should that person do in such a situation? Now, Imam Quduuri Rahmatullahi, he mentions that if somebody has a doubt whether he's prayed 3 or 4, whether he's prayed 2 or 3, وَذَلِكَ أَوَّلُ مَا أُرِدَ لَهُ. And this doubt which he has had, or which he's having, it's the very first time he's having it. Now, what does he mean by أَوَّلُ مَا أُرِدَ لَهُ? Shamsul Aimma Sarakhsi Rahimullah, a very famous Hanafi scholar, is of the view that Ma urida lahu, awwala ma urida lahu, is in the meaning of sometimes. That if that person sometimes, very rarely, but sometimes once in a blue moon, he gets a doubt in Salah whether he's prayed 3 rakats, whether he's prayed 4. Some of the opinions of awwalu ma urida lahu is that it's the first time he had that doubt in that Salah. So he's praying, say, 4 rakat Salah, and then this is the first doubt which he had, whether it's 3 rakats or whether it's 4. And then there is a third opinion of the sentence awwalu ma urida lahu, which is zindagi mein pehle martaba, which means in English the first time in his life where he's got a doubt, where he had a doubt whether he's prayed 3 rakats or whether he's prayed 4. In that situation, ista'nafa salah. Such a person should pray and start the salah all over again. So what we can gather here is that if it's once in a blue moon, or the very first time in your life you have a doubt whether you pray 3 rakats or 4, in that situation the Sharia says, the Sharia dictates, ista'nafa salah, you should start the salah and the prayer all over again. The Sharia, however, then stipulates that if this person regularly has doubts, whether he's prayed 3 rakats, whether he's prayed 4, whether he's prayed 2, whether he's prayed 3, whether he's on his first rakat, whether he's on his second rakat, then in that situation, bana ala ghalibi dhannihi in kana lahu dhannun, which means that he would act upon what we call his dhann ghalib, what we call his investigation, and whatever his tahqiq and whatever his investigation, whatever his mind is saying that it's most likely the first rakat, it's most likely the second rakat. So whatever his investigation, whatever his dhann ghalib is, he will act upon that. So if, say, for example, that person thinks, oh, do you know what, most likely I'm on my second rakat, or most probably I'm on my third rakat, he will act according to that. And now listen carefully. He will then have to do a sajda sahwa at the end. So keep that in mind. If you are acting upon dhann ghalib, if you are acting upon investigation or tahqiq and you think, or most likely it's my third rakat, then what will happen is that you will then do a sajda sahwa, prostration of error at the end. However, it goes on to say, وَإِن لَمْ يَكُنْ لَهُ ظَنٌّ بَنَا عَلَى الْيَقِينِ, that if this person does not have dhann ghalib, his mind is totally blank, he doesn't know whether he's prayed 2 rakats, whether he's prayed 3 rakats, then in that situation he should act upon yaqeen, he should act upon certainty, and yaqeen and certainty is that he's doubting whether it's 2 or 3, so you'll start from 2 because he's sure, or he knows that he's prayed 1 for sure, so he definitely must be on his second rakat, so he will continue to pray from the second rakat. And again, more importantly here, sajda sahwa is not obligatory. Prostration of error is not obligatory, so keep that in mind. Prostration of error is only obligatory if you've used investigation, if you use tahqiq, if you've kind of, thought to yourself that this is most likely the second rakat or the third rakat, only then you will do a prostration of error. However, if somebody is acting upon yaqeen and certainty in terms of the minimum number of rakat, then there's no need for him to do a prostration of error at the end. So that concludes the section with regards to sajda sahwa and the prostration of error. There is another section which follows afterwards with regards to the prayer of an ill person and a sick person. This topic we'll look at in next week's lesson. The next topic thereafter is in Arabic entitled as Babu Sujudi Tilawa, which in English means the chapter regarding the prostration of recitation. Now there are, according to Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayh, 14 verses in the Holy Quran where if a person was to recite that particular verse, which we call the sajda verse, the verse of the sajda, it then becomes obligatory and wajib for that person to make a prostration and to make a sajda in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now there are two ways in performing this sajda tilawa and the prostration of recitation. The first way, which is the best way, and that is that one should stand up. He should then say Allahu Akbar, so there's no need for you to raise your hands. You would say Allahu Akbar, going to sajda, going to prostration, recite Subhana Rabbiyal A'la 3 times, then you will say Allahu Akbar, and then you can revert all the way back to your standing position, or if you want, you can just sit back down again. So that's one way of performing the sajda tilawa. The second way of performing the sajda tilawa is by sitting. So from a sitting position, you will say Allahu Akbar. You go into sajda, you go into prostration, you say Subhana Rabbiyal A'la 3 times, you then say Allahu Akbar, and then you revert back to your sitting position. So these are the two ways to perform the sajda tilawa and the prostration of tilawat and recitation. Now, just a few rulings with regards to the sajda tilawa before we look at the text which is in front of us. The first ruling, remember, is that this sajda tilawa, when it is being recited, or the sajda verse, when it is being recited, so if it is recited in the Arabic language, it is obligatory, or what I mean by Arabic language, i.e. when it is recited from the Holy Quran, it is obligatory for the reciter, i.e. the tali, and the sami', i.e. the listener, to perform the sajda tilawa, to perform the prostration of recitation. It becomes wajib. However, if this verse of sajda is recited or is translated in the English language, or in Urdu, or in Persian, or in any other language besides the language of the Holy Quran, i.e. Arabic, then sajda tilawa would only be obligatory if that person understood the words and the meaning of the verse, in terms of he understood that he had to prostrate. Because when we look at the 14 verses which do have the prostration, it's got the words wasjud or wasjudu, which means prostrate, prostrate. So if, say for example, that particular verse was translated into English and then that person understood that actually Allah is ordering us to prostrate, so therefore it becomes obligatory for that individual to prostrate. Some other rulings here. If a person heard the sajda tilawa, i.e. the verses of prostration being recited from CDs, from cassettes, from anything else, then what would happen is that the question which people ask is that do we still have to perform the sajda tilawa? So the answer is no, because sajda tilawa is only obligatory if somebody was to hear the sajda tilawa or the sajda verses verbally. If it was pre-recorded, or if somebody played it on a cassette or a CD and he heard the words of the Quran and the verses of sajda, then sajda tilawa does not become obligatory. And the same rule also applies for if somebody heard the verses of sajda from television, from radios. So again, the same ruling also applies, that if it is pre-recorded, if the radio program is pre-recorded, if the television program is pre-recorded, then the verse which he has heard, because it's not live, it's not being said verbally, sajda tilawa would not be obligatory. However, if the radio program was live or the television program was live and he heard the sajda tilawa, then in that situation, sajda tilawa would be obligatory to perform. Some of the rulings here which can be found in the books of fiqh, that if someone recited the sajda tilawa, the sajda verse, and thereafter he recited 3 verses without performing the sajda tilawa, then the ruling is that the sajda or the prostration which he now is going to perform in the salah, in the prayer, that would now be considered as a substitute for the sajda tilawa which he should have done. So just say for example somebody recited a sajda tilawa verse and he should have done the sajda, the prostration there and then, but he didn't. He then recited 3 verses of the Holy Quran thereafter. So as soon as he recites the 3rd verse, he can't now revert and go back and do the prostration of tilawa, but instead what will now happen is that the prostration which he is now going to do for the salah, that would now be considered to be a substitute for the sajda tilawa and the prostration of tilawa which you should have done. However, if somebody recited 1 or 2 verses after the sajda tilawa and he didn't perform the sajda tilawa and he then went into ruku, then the ruling is that such a person now will have to perform a sajda sahwa and a prostration of error at the end of the salah, for the salah to be considered valid and acceptable in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now we're just going to have a look at the text which is in front of us. Imam Quduuri rahmatullah alayhi, he firstly says that في القرآن 14 سجدة, that there are 14 sajda verses in the Holy Quran. في آخر الأعراف, the first one is in the last verse of Surah A'raf. وفي الرعد, the second one is in Surah Ra'd. وفي النحل, the third one is in Surah Nahl. وفي بني Israel, the fourth one is in Banu Israel, i.e. Surah Bani Israel, which is the beginning of the 15th para, wa Maryam, wal Ula fil Hajj. Then the next one thereafter is the first one in Surah Hajj. Now just keep this in mind. According to Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah, he is of the view, as all of you know, that Surah Hajj has got two sajda verses. One is at the beginning of the surah, well, not exactly the beginning, but 2 or 3 pages after the beginning of that surah, and the second sajda verse is on the last page of that particular surah. Ya ayyuhallazina amanu ruk'u wasjudu wa'budu rabbakum waf'alul khayra la'allakum tuflihun. Now, according to Imam Abu Hanifa rahmatullah alayh, he is of the view that only the first sajda verse of Surah Hajj is a sajda verse. So therefore, if somebody recited that, he will have to perform a sajda tilawa. However, if somebody recited the second sajda tilawa, the sajda verse, Ya ayyuhallazina amanu ruk'u wasjudu, that particular verse, then there is no, or it is not obligatory for him to perform the sajda tilawa, because in the Hanafi fiqh we say that only the first sajda verse of Surah Hajj is a sajda verse, hence you will have to perform sajda tilawa. However, the second one is not a sajda verse, so therefore it is not obligatory and wajib to perform a sajda tilawa. Then the text then goes on to say, wal Furqan, that the next sajda verse can be found in Surah Furqan, Surah Namal, Surah Alif Lam Mim Tanzil, Surah Swad, Surah Hamim Sajda, Surah Najm, Surah Inshiqaq, and lastly Wal Alaq, Surah Alaq, Iqra Bismi Rabbika Allazi Khalaq. The next text, the author Imam Quduuri rahmatullah then goes on to say that was sujood wajibun fi hadhihi al-mawadi' ala tali was sami'. As I already explained, that sajda tilawa is obligatory on the tali, so the person who recited the sajda verses, was sami', and also on that person who heard the sajda verse. Sawa'un qasada sima' al-Qur'an aw lam yaqsud, whether the sami', i.e. the listener, made the intention to listen to the sajda verses or not, it doesn't matter. As long as it was said in the language of the Quran, i.e. in Arabic, and the listener, he heard it, so whether he understood whether it was actually a sajda verse or not. Because many of the times when people pray in Taraweeh behind the Imam, they don't know it's a sajda verse, but because they've heard it, because the Imam had recited, the Hafiz had recited it, so because they've heard it, so it now becomes obligatory to go into sajda and perform the sajda tilawa. The next text then more or less explains the same. The Imam Quduuri rahmatullah says that فَإِذَا تَلَى الْإِمَامِ آيَةَ السَّجْدَةِ, that when the Imam recites the verse of sajda, sajadaha, he, i.e. the Imam, will perform the sajda, will perform the prostration, وَسَجْدَ الْمَعْمُومُ مَعَهُ, and the followers will also perform sajda and prostration with the Imam. And this is based on what I explained before as well, in particular in last week's lesson, under the section of the prostration of error, that if the Imam was to make the mistake, then because the Imam's or the follower's salah is connected with the Imam's salah, it's linked and attached with the Imam's salah. So if the Imam makes a mistake, the follower will also make a mistake. It's as though the follower has made the mistake. If the Imam is performing the prostration of error, the followers will also have to perform the prostration of error. Exactly here in sajda tilawa as well, when the Imam had recited the sajda verse, he is now performing the sajda and the prostration. It now becomes obligatory for the followers and the muqtadis to follow, to also perform the sajda tilawa and the prostration of recitation. However, it then goes and says, فَإِن تَلَى الْمَعْمُومِ لَمْ يَلْزَمِ الْإِمَامِ وَلِلْمَعْمُومِ السُّجُودِ. However, just say if the follower in Salah, he shouldn't have, because we read this topic before, that it is makruh tahrimi, severely disliked. In the Hanafi fiqh, this is for the followers to recite anything behind the Imam, whether it is Surah Fatiha or any other portion of the Holy Quran, whether it is done loudly, whether it is done quietly. So just say if the follower recited a sajda verse loudly in Salah. So the text says, Lam yalzamil imam. The Imam and nor the muqtadi, the follower who recited the sajda verse, would have to perform the sajda tilawa and the prostration of tilawa and recitation, because as I already explained before, the muqtadi, the followers, they are subservient to the Imam, they are following the Imam and not the other way around. Same in the sajda sahwa section we looked at last week, that if the follower gets a mistake, the Imam is not going to make the prostration of error. So similarly, if the follower is reciting the sajda tilawa, the sajda verse, the Imam would not perform the sajda tilawa, and nor would the muqtadi and the followers would perform the sajda tilawa. Thereafter, Imam Quduuri rahmatullahi alayhi, he then explains one or two what we call secondary rulings, furu'i rulings. And he explains that, just say for example, if a person is in salah, and whilst in salah, so either he's behind the Imam or individually he's praying salah, and then whilst in salah he hears a person next to him, say, reciting a sajda verse. Now this person next to him is reciting the sajda verse. Either it could be that he's in salah himself and he's reciting the sajda verse, or he's doing some kind of Quran tilawat, some Quran recitation, and he's reciting the sajda verse. So the text then goes on to say that the first person who's in salah, when he hears somebody else reciting a sajda verse, and that somebody else is not in the same salah as him, so a third person is reciting a sajda verse in either in salah or he's just doing some kind of qira'at and some kind of recitation. So the text then goes on to say that lam yasjudha fi salah, that person would not make sajda or prostration, the first individual would not make sajda or a prostration in salah. And if he did do it, then the text goes on to say that this is not sufficient or permissible for him, but his salah will not break. And thereafterwards, Imam Quduuri rahmatullah then goes on to explain that if somebody in one majlis or in one gathering is reciting the sajda verse over and over again, like Huffaz, those who have memorized the Quran, or those who are training to memorize the Holy Quran, then in that situation, because he's in the same majlis, the gathering is still the same, so therefore one sajda tilawa would be sufficient, and there's no need for him to do, say if he recited the same verse, he was practicing and reading that same verse 20 times, so there's no need for him to make 20 sajda tilawas. One sajda tilawa would be sufficient and would be valid. And then lastly, Imam Quduuri rahmatullahi then explains وَمَنْ أَرَادَ السُّجُودَ, how to perform the sajda tilawa, and it says that the person who wants to perform the sajda tilawa, he would firstly kabbara, he would say Allahu Akbar, وَلَمْ يَرْفَعْ يَدَيْهِ. As I explained, he would not raise his hands, so he would not raise his hands like we do for takbir al-tahrima when we start our salah, for our 5 daily prayers, for our Eid, for our Jummah. So he would not pray like that, but instead he would say Allahu Akbar. He would not raise his hands. Was sajada, he will go into prostration, and he, in the state of prostration, he would recite tasbih. There is a chapter in Sunan Abu Dawood where he actually explains that he can recite other kind of du'as and other kind of supplications ثم كبر, he will then say Allahu Akbar. ورفع رأسه, he would then raise his head. And then the author, Imam Quduuri Rahmatullah, then explains that in Sajda Tilawa, now when he comes to perform in Sajda Tilawa, the prostration of recitation, وَلَا تَشَهُّدَ عَلَيْهِ وَلَا salam, that there is no need for a person to perform tashahhud, wala salama, tashahhud meaning that you don't have to read at-tahiyyat afterwards, wala salama, and there's no need for you to do salam. So when you perform, or when you come up from the sajda and the prostration, and when you're sitting down, then that's it. There's no need for you to do salam to the right or to the left to conclude or to finish the sajda tilawa. So as I've already explained, you say Allahu Akbar, you go down, you do the sajda, you do the prostration, and then you get back up again. And that in a nutshell explains the way of performing the sajda tilawa, which in the Hanafi fiqh is wajib. And as I explained before, that if somebody in salah or whether outside salah, even though many of the rulings which we looked at touched on salah, but it's not really linked with salah exclusively. If somebody is reciting the Holy Quran and he came across one of these verses and he recited it and he didn't do the sajda tilawa, then he has omitted out a wajib, obligatory act. And the ruling regards to obligatory act similar to farad in terms of he would be sinful for his actions. So it's very important that whenever we come across a sajda tilawa, whether it is in recitation, whether it is in salah, that we perform it, and it's always best to perform it straight away, because if you don't, then what could happen is that, hundreds and hundreds could gather, and then it becomes difficult for you to perform the sajda tilawa individually for each one of them. We leave it there for this week. May Allah give us the tawfiq to act on what's been said. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.